What's up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danielle Hallan, and I am back with another true crime video. But first, I want to say a massive thank you to each and every one of you that stopped by my booth the other weekend at CrimeCon. I absolutely love meeting you guys and hugging you and thanking you for supporting my channel and these families by watching and sharing all of my content. It means the absolute world to me to be able to put faces behind this camera that I'm constantly talking to and have been talking to for 8 years now. It is always so refreshing to get to have these conversations with you and hear what cases kind of resonated with you the most. Again, thank you so much if you stopped by my table and showed me a little bit of support or took a missing persons flyer with you, or if you gave me a case suggestion. I'm so thankful. And also, welcome if you met me at CrimeCon and decided to give my channel a look. Thank you for being here. I'm happy you're part of the family. CrimeCon was such an incredible experience this year. There were so many amazing creators there, specifically a lot of YouTubers that I think are just honestly the cream of the crop, like the best people in the world. Rachel Shannon, I've met her once before, but she's genuinely the most down-to-earth, sweet, kind, genuine person in the world. Cheryl and Dale, I was able to meet for the first time. She's absolutely incredible, you guys. She's so funny and just so dedicated to what she does. And of course, we know that I love my John Lorden and Stephanie Harlow. I know that next year CrimeCon is going to be in Denver. I am not 100% certain if I'll be there yet, but I really do encourage you guys to go. I got to speak to lots of different families. I met Egypt Covington's family. I got to meet Chelsea Cobo's mom, Jason Landry's parents. It was just, I have goosebumps. It was such an incredible weekend. To top off the weekend, I actually found out that my TV show Gone with Danielle Hallan is now streaming live on Plex. I've already told you guys you can find Gone with Danielle on Roku, but now you can find it on the Mysteria channel on Plex. You can tune in to see me discuss fascinating true crime stories that really deserve awareness, and also check out some awesome true crime creators that are on there alongside me. To watch for free, you just have to download the Plex app on your smart TV, select live TV, and search Mysteria. This is such an awesome opportunity for me to get my content and these stories out to a larger and different audience. And the more support that I can get from you guys, the further we can spread awareness together. Now, after all of that rambling, I am going to get into today's video. And this is a very interesting case that I stumbled across out of curiosity, because a while back I went to a festival in my town and the Forest Service was there. And so my kids were, talking to them and learning all these things and, coloring pictures of Smokey the Bear. Me and my husband were talking to them about, their job. They were telling us all about their travels and spending months at a time in the mountains fire spotting. And of course it's me. So then I start wondering, after hearing all of this, has anyone ever gone missing from a fire tower? And so when I got home, I did a quick Google search, and it turns out that someone has. And it's actually a very mysterious and older case that the RCMP are still working on to this day. And so far, it is the only case like this that I can find. Today, we're going to be speaking about the disappearance and believed murder of 70-year-old Stephanie Stewart outside of Hinton, Alberta. Now, Stephanie Stewart had a long-standing love for the outdoors, and despite her age and her smaller stature, weighing only about 100 pounds and being 5'2" at the time of her disappearance, she was a force to be reckoned with. Stephanie had always been physically active her whole life. She loved to hike, she loved to explore, and she cycled solo across Canada in her 60s, which is just absolutely amazing. And then at 69, so just a year prior to when she disappeared, she climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. And I'm over here at the ripe old age of 31, like I could do neither of those things. Those that knew Stephanie said, quote, "She was an inspiration to all of us, always a smile on her face at the end of the day. Hers was a determined spirit." So it makes perfect sense that Stephanie had been working with the Alberta Sustainable Resource Development fire spotting for the past 18 years prior to her disappearance. And it takes a very special person to do this kind of job. There are over, I think, like 120 some fire fire towers that are in Alberta alone, and a third of them are only accessible by boat or air. So as you can see, it can be very isolating and intimidating. Fire spotters spend entire summers in these locations, and while they are encouraged to bring someone with them or at least a pet, most of the time these people are alone because typically the people that go for these kinds of jobs, this is their element. They like to be off the beaten path. They're capable of caring for themselves in isolating situations. They're not scared of being alone in the middle of the woods. Like, this is exactly the kind of environment they want to be in. And all of that describes Stephanie to a T. Everyone that knew her said that she was the happiest when she was at her lookout. She spent her winter months in Canmore, and then from April to September, she was able to flee to her beloved Athabasca cabin and lookout tower. She had worked at this specific tower for 13 of her 18 years as a fire spotter, so she knew this place like the back of her hand. She was familiar with the cabin and the trails and the hikers, the routine, and unlike a lot of those fire towers that I just described in Alberta, this one had over 1,000 visitors each year. This tower, while it is kind of remote, it's not nearly as remote as a lot of the other ones. It's accessible by car. It was right off of this very long, winding gravel road that led to a popular lookout spot. It was also accessible by trails, and it's only 15 miles or so from the town of Hinton, and it's right off of Highway 40. And according to those that worked with her all of those years, she was such a warm and welcoming person. She loved to speak to these hikers that would pass by about her job and about the history of her lookout tower and what they can do to help prevent forest fires. So she didn't mind the visitors at all. It was just a fun perk of her job. And while she wasn't working up in the tower, she was tending to a garden that she had been nurturing for over a decade at this point. She would read books. She would embroider. I can only imagine what the views were like where she was at. Her summers working at the tower were basically like this beautiful vacation for her. But then came August 15th, 2006. Now, to give you a better visual of the setup, Stephanie had a nice cabin at the base of the fire tower. Now, I personally had never seen this type of setup before. All of the fire towers that I am familiar with in the United States, the tower and cabin are one. So like, you climb up that ladder, you're at the top of the tower, and you pretty much stay there unless you have to go and get supplies. But Stephanie was able to get her feet on the ground, stay the night in her cabin, and then in the morning, she would harness up and climb up to her 40-foot tower as her watch post. Now, having worked this job for so long, Stephanie was like clockwork. Depending on who the spotters work for, there's certain protocol that they have to follow. And obviously the most crucial is that there needs to be a constant line of communication. And Stephanie was expected to call into her supervisor 3 times a day to report the conditions at her tower. And that particular morning, Stephanie's supervisor noticed that she had not called in yet for her morning weather report. I believe at the initial time they noticed this, it was around 8 or so in the morning. And Stephanie knew what was expected of her. She hadn't missed a call to date, but nobody felt the need to panic just yet because of that. They figured Stephanie just got a late start. She was probably making her climb up to the top of the tower, and she would eventually call in. But as the minutes passed, there was still no call, and concern was growing at this point. So her command post began to call her cabin repeatedly to check and see if she was okay. And according to some articles, and take this with a grain of salt because I've not seen this stated everywhere, I've seen some reports that several of those calls were answered, but nobody said a word. It was complete silence. And then after a few seconds of nothing, whoever was on Stephanie's side would hang up. And so by 8:30, after this had happened a few times, her supervisor knew something was not right at all. And despite the fact that she was, healthy and active, unexpected things can happen to anyone. So right away, they decided to send out another fire spotter to Stephanie's cabin to make sure that everything was all right. Now, when this person arrived at Stephanie's cabin, her Dodge Ram pickup was still parked outside. So this put a sinking feeling in everyone's stomach. There was no other way for her to really get away anywhere. Again, it was 15 miles to town. She was at the very end of a long gravel road, and it was like the only way in and out of this particular cabin. So if her car wasn't gone and she wasn't answering the phone, then where was she? But things only got worse when they approached the cabin itself and found that there was a decent amount of blood on the steps leading to her door. Inside of the cabin, it seemed as if Stephanie had been stopped while in the middle of making breakfast or coffee or something, because there was a pot of boiling water still on the stove, which meant that whatever happened to her had to have happened somewhat recently. There were no signs of Stephanie. They called out for her, checked up in her tower, and ultimately she was never found. So the RCMP was called to report Stephanie Stewart as missing. Nobody could figure out where on earth Stephanie could have gone, but it seemed like the consensus was that she didn't leave on her own. And it wasn't likely that she had gone to run errands in town, because according to her supervisor, she would always call in to let them know that she was going to be away from her cabin and her tower. And she would also call around to other spotters in the area so that they could keep an extra eye out her way, since she wouldn't be there to monitor the conditions. And so it just didn't seem like the most likely scenario. So they wondered what could have stopped her mid-morning that would cause her to disappear. They started to think maybe this was a medical emergency that, made her wander off, or maybe this was an animal attack. But obviously, something went very wrong that morning. First responders arrived, and after a very brief search of the area, they came to the horrifying conclusion that Stephanie had likely fallen victim to an animal attack. Maybe she had heard a noise and came outside to investigate, and a bear or some other large animal crossed her path, or they even wondered if maybe she had been trying to start her climb up to the tower and was surprised by an animal. So she tried to run back to the safety of her cabin, and they caught up with her as she was climbing the stairs. And when they found scat, fur, and animal prints at the base of her tower, this just seemed to confirm their theory further, and that was devastating. So more Mounties came out to the area and they began the search for essentially her body. Searchers were checking all around the nearby area on foot and horseback. They had aerial searches with helicopters that were equipped with infrared, but there was still no sign of Stephanie. And if it had been an animal attack of some sort, the chances that her body was very far were really, really slim. So they started to wonder if they maybe got it wrong, because at this point, they expected to see more of a definitive sign that they were on the right track. So they decided to bring in a conservation officer who was also an expert in animal attacks. And he took a look at the scene, he checked out the fur and the footprints and things like that, and concluded that this was not at all an animal attack. This was something different. While there was blood found on the steps of her cabin and there were a few signs of animals at the base of her tower, all of the telltale signs of an actual attack were missing. The expert could not find a single spot around the cabin where it appeared that the initial attack occurred. If there had in fact been a vicious attack, you would see exactly where it had been. There would also be obvious signs of a struggle, torn up grass, tossed around piles of dirt, pools of blood. There was no trail of blood at all, showing that she had been dragged off. There were no shreds of clothing or hair. Instead, it just seemed that those animal tracks at the base of the tower were just animal tracks, just a wandering animal. And the blood on the stairs was something else entirely. So at this point, the major crimes unit stepped in, and this is where things got even weirder. They had been so focused on believing this was an animal attack because no one thought it could ever be anything different that they had missed a bunch of things going on inside of the cabin. And when they took a look into her cabin, not only had there been this pot of boiling water on the stove, which was already an odd detail, but there were several items missing from her cabin as well. 2 pillows, along with 2 blue pillowcases, a burgundy sheet that had been on her bed, and what they described as a Navajo patterned duvet. Why would all of her bedding go missing with her? And I know each and every one of you is hearing that and thinking that usually when you see that, it is not a good sign. And the only thing that was missing other than that of Stephanie's was a broken gold wristwatch that was of huge sentimental value to her. And so they're kind of getting these conflicting details at this point, because all of the missing bedding is a huge indicator of potential foul play. But then this sentimental piece of jewelry that's missing, it was something that she would never leave without. So did she maybe take it and leave? They weren't really sure what to think at this point, but they had this overwhelming feeling inkling that there was something nefarious going on here. So after fully analyzing the scene, the RCMP ultimately ruled her disappearance as suspicious and announced that it was very possible she had been killed, which shocked everybody. The RCMP to this day have not released a timeline of any sort or really spoken about the evidence that they found within the cabin to lead them to this conclusion. So I have no idea at all if there was more blood that was found inside, or maybe there was some sort of physical evidence to suggest someone else had been there. The only thing they have publicly stated was that inside of her cabin, there were, quote, obvious signs of a disturbance. So it sounds like she fought with someone inside of the cabin. But who on earth would have gone all the way out there to target her that early in the morning, and why? Searches in the area continued because Stephanie and all of her belongings had to end up somewhere. So they had more helicopters and ground searches, they had dive teams out and boats and all of the nearby rivers, but they were still coming up with nothing. This was just such a bizarre situation. And as I said in the beginning of this video, this had never been an issue before. Despite the fact that these fire spotters were in kind of like precarious situations, being isolated in the middle of the wilderness, there had never been any safety complaints before. So this just came out of absolute nowhere. And of all people, 70-year-old Stephanie Stewart, who was legitimately not a threat to anybody. So after just 5 days of searching and trying to figure out what was going on, authorities called the search off because they just weren't finding anything. And they announced that they were now changing this to a criminal investigation. They said that at this point, they had been able to rule out a lot. And again, we don't know what they had to rule all of this out, but we've just got to trust what they're saying. But apparently they ruled out that she had a medical episode. They don't believe that that occurred and, she wandered off. They also were able to rule out any sort of accident. So to me, that says that they have some pretty large piece of evidence that they've just not released to this day. Some also theorize that maybe her bedding was gone because she decided to spend a night in the woods, but all of her camping gear had been accounted for. She also wouldn't have taken those things very far, and they had thoroughly searched the surrounding area, and since none of those things were found, they were able to rule this out as well. Based on all the evidence that they had, the only option left was that Stephanie had been killed and taken somewhere and likely dumped. Stephanie's daughter ended up coming forward to make a plea to the public alongside the RCMP. She had just spoken to her mom at 9 p.m. the night before she vanished, and she said she didn't notice anything amiss. Her mom hadn't mentioned someone coming over to visit or that she had plans to go anywhere. She seemed in a great mood. Her daughter also said she had no enemies at all. She couldn't think of a single reason why someone might want to hurt her. So they had no idea where to start. The obscure location of her cabin also made the entire situation even more strange. Someone would have had to specifically be going out to this area to target Stephanie or target the cabin. The chance that someone just so happened to stumble across this and decide to commit a potentially very heinous act just didn't seem anywhere near as likely. You don't just end up in this spot without knowing where you're going and knowing why. Again, this was a one-way in and out situation by car. And since the cabin was up for grabs for half the year when fire spotters weren't even working there, why would someone choose to go if it had someone living in it? Which to me just makes it seem more likely that Stephanie was the intended target and not the cabin itself. But again, why Stephanie? And there were still so many more questions. Why was someone possibly answering the phone repeatedly and hanging it up when just ignoring it may have been less suspicious? Was Stephanie maybe doing this, but she was hurt and could not say anything or help herself? Was this her way of signaling, I need someone to come here? And the time frame for all of this was so short as well. Again, it seemed like Stephanie was interrupted that morning while boiling water, and someone was out at the cabin pretty shortly after to check on her. And that doesn't really give anyone a lot of time to clean up and get out of there. So really the only thing that authorities had working for them was this hope that someone very likely went up there by car in order to get in there, get out so fast, possibly take Stephanie and all these bedding items with them. So they called on the public. They said, please, if you have any tips, if you saw someone driving around in that area that early morning, let us know so we can try to figure out who may have have been up there. But unfortunately, it just doesn't seem like this helped them get anywhere. Despite it being one way in and out of the cabin by car, the road emptied out onto a rural side road, and from there, someone easily could have hopped onto Highway 40 and been gone. And the entire area north of this is just endless wilderness. That left so much space, an impossible amount of space to potentially search if her body was tossed along the way. But RCMP held out hope that they have tried endlessly and they have remained confident they will figure out what happened. At this point, it was heading into hunting season, so there was going to be a lot of people in the area. So RCMP again asked people to keep their eye out. Maybe they would be able to bring forward evidence hiding somewhere in the woods. Because despite the fact they did a very extensive search of the area, these are gigantic national parks, but with that much land to cover, you can never confidently say that you fully have ruled out an entire area. But even with the community helping as much as they possibly could, checking while they were out hunting, checking while they were enjoying the trails, still there was nothing. So in September of that year, the union Stephanie was with and the Parks Ministry offered up a $20,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. And they believed that this might entice someone because of one possible theory that had been going around amongst the locals. Now, in the years prior to Stephanie's disappearance, it seems there had been a large increase in drug use and drug crimes in the area. I guess there were a lot of new oil businesses heading up that way, and there was just a big flood of people, and it brought in things like meth and cocaine, and the local police had been working nonstop to shut down numerous drug trafficking operations, and it had been a really messy situation. And a few years prior, and just a few miles down the road, there had been a drug-related death. And while I don't think that was related to Stephanie's disappearance in any way, it just kind of went to show what was happening in this area. And according to what police had found in their investigation into all of the drug trafficking, these people were relying on the rural back roads to make moves and sales. And they had been caught by RCMP and things like abandoned homes on back roads, old trails, and actually a lot of them were found or captured underneath or really close to fire towers in the area. So it was theorized that maybe they saw this winding road into the woods leading up to Stephanie's cabin as a great spot to make a deal. They believed it would be a safe spot in an isolated place. It was very close to the highway, so that would be a quick retreat for them. It was close enough to the nearby town that it was relatively quick to get to. Now, I've seen this theory go a few different ways on different forums online. There's some people that speculate that these drug dealers showed up at her cabin thinking that it was abandoned. And Stephanie, being the feisty woman that we know she is, she was likely surprised by them, but she fought back. And considering authorities said there was an obvious sign of disturbance in the cabin, this all seems to add up. But unfortunately, people speculate that one thing led to another, and she was killed, thrown in a car, and dumped somewhere. Now, my personal issue with this theory is that drug dealers trying to be sneaky don't typically go places where there's very obviously someone there. It just completely defeats the purpose of going to the middle of nowhere, going and driving down this off the beaten path gravel road miles into the woods. So the idea that these people, these potential drug traffickers, went to the middle of nowhere specifically to not be seen, then they for some reason chose to go into a very obviously inhabited cabin, then committed an unplanned murder, and then took it a step further to hide the body, it just doesn't really add up to me. And so the other way that I saw this theory presented makes a little bit more sense. Maybe she had already seen something that she shouldn't have, and someone came back to take care of her. Just past her house is a large area that is part of the hiking lookout point, and maybe there was a deal that was done up there, or maybe there was a deal done along the extreme length of winding road through the woods. Maybe no one specifically went to Stephanie's cabin, but was around it, and she stumbled across it and saw something that she wasn't supposed to see. And while this does seem more plausible to me, I just still feel like it seems unlikely. I don't think that that kind of energy would be put into Stephanie. Every time local traffickers were caught by the RCMP, It just seems like they picked up and moved on to another private, quiet location. They did their best to lay low, and this was something that would easily gather a lot of attention. But because that possibility was still there, the RCMP were hoping that maybe this hefty reward would bring someone forward, because money is clearly a huge motivator in that world. But nothing happened, and with the winter coming, everything closed down. Snow buried any evidence. There could be no more searches. They had to wait until the spring of 2007 when the snow had melted. And when that happened, the RCMP hit the ground running to try and get clues. They handed out flyers to local hikers in the area and campers, and they even decided to write letters to anyone who was registered to a nearby campsite in August of 2006. Maybe someone didn't realize that they saw something while they were out on vacation, and once they went home, the chances that they heard of this case were slim to none. But unfortunately, this didn't bring forward any new information either. The RCMP decided to then put up billboards in the area, and they also put up flyers in Jasper National Park that was nearby, but still no tips led to answers. The only thing that really seemed to be moving at this point in a positive direction was a push for a safer environment for fire spotters. An investigative report was started into the safety of fire towers, but it seems they were already like 10 steps ahead because they never wanted this to happen to anyone else. I told you earlier, there had been no safety complaints as of this point, but it was kind of one of those things where it just takes one time to realize all that needs to change and what could possibly happen. So they started to tighten security at every single one of the fire towers. They equipped everyone with a two-way radio with a panic button for emergencies. They had personal locator beacons that spotters had to have on them at all times. Self-defense training became a new requirement, and they even bumped up the amount of checks that all these spotters had to call into their supervisors per day. No one had really even realized the precarious situation that these fire spotters were in, because obviously the first thing they're thinking of is the outdoors, the perils that can come with that, and isolation in a rural location. What if there's a medical emergency? But I don't think anyone really ever considered the possibility of what if there's bad people out there that pose a threat. And towers, just like Stephanie's, that were very accessible, they oftentimes even had signs out for hikers that would lead the public right to these cabins, right to these fire towers. People would walk up or drive up to them as if they were some sort of spectacle and not a work environment and someone's home, because it was almost like this tourist attraction that people could go and see, which is awesome. But at the same time, you get one wrong person and it can go very, very badly. And that's what seemed to be happening here. So they started to take down all of those signs. They started to put fences up around all of the towers, and they put gates on the roads that people could use to drive right up. So that particular gravel road everyone was using to drive up to her cabin and up to the lookout, that was all closed off. So if you wanted to get anywhere in that area, you had to be dedicated to hiking there. They also improved the locks on the doors and the windows, because apparently some of them didn't even have any, and they switched to reinforced steel doors instead of just having wood. And while all of these changes were so great, it came at a great cost as well. Years passed and the media really stopped talking as much about Stephanie. And obviously when that happens, the tips also slowed down. And 12 years passed without any real movement, until finally in 2018, the RCMP decided to give it another go. They hoped that this time, with new advances in technology and forensics, maybe they had a better chance. Maybe they could find something. So they put together a team of over 100 people from rescue teams all over the province, and they put up a command post by the fire tower and spent 5 days searching over 30 square miles. And some of the searchers participating in this particular search had been at the original search for Stephanie all those years ago. So this was a very personal thing for everyone in the area. They had every searcher equipped with GPS to make sure that they checked every inch of the area. They also heavily focused this search in areas where Stephanie's body may have been disposed of, including Jarvis Lake and along Highway 40, which again was my biggest fear when I looked at a map of this area. It is honestly incredible to see so much effort put into this case, even after 12 years had passed, because typically where I'm from, you don't see action like that unless there is some sort of groundbreaking tip. But the RCMP said, no, there is no tip. There's nothing that's pushing us to do this again other than our desire to bring Stephanie home, which is just the most heartwarming thing to hear. But unfortunately, that search ended with no new evidence or answers. So Stephanie's case was handed to the Historical Homicide Unit in hopes that more direct focus may finally solve the case someday soon. At this point, speculative theories are really all that we have, and there are a lot of them, understandably. There are a lot of people out there that have this thing with people going missing in the woods and national parks. It's like a whole other true crime genre in itself, and it's just one of those mysterious disappearances where you could drum up just endless possibilities of what could happen, everything from reasonable things to far-fetched. Now, some people believe that maybe it was a frequent hiker, someone that was familiar with the area, and possibly Stephanie. After all, it doesn't seem like her door was busted in or anything like that, so maybe she let someone in that morning. Maybe it was someone that she knew and thought she could trust, and something happened. Other people believe that maybe she had ongoing issues with someone in the area, and finally that came to a head. And some have disregarded the RCMP's findings altogether and believe that Stephanie simply ran off from her life. But so far, no evidence proves any of these theories. But there's one particular theory that people seem very, very focused on, and that is that a man named Travis Vader was potentially involved. Travis was a drifter in the area with a pretty long criminal history of theft and arson, amongst other things, but I have no idea if authorities themselves have ever weighed in on the possibility that he may have been involved in whatever happened to Stephanie. Now, I've seen a few podcasts and places say that local authorities have said they believe he could be, but I've never seen any source that directly leads me to anyone saying any statement. So if you are familiar with this case and have it, please feel free to leave it down below. But on July 5th, 2010, so just a few years after Stephanie went missing, Edson Fire Department responded to a camper that was on fire at Minnow Lake Campground. And when they arrived, they found that the camper was empty. There was no one in it, thankfully. But that also meant they had to do some legwork to figure out who it belonged to. And they were able to find that the camper belonged to a couple, Lyle and Marie McCann, who were in their 70s. And initially, no one really put two and two together that they were also missing. It wasn't until days later that the couple's family called to say, hey, we can't find our family. And police were like, wait a minute, what is their name again? We found their camper on fire. Now, police originally believed that this was just an accidental fire and, maybe it was someone's that they had left there. Maybe it was an insurance thing. You never know. But now they have a serious problem. The McCanns had been pulling a car behind their camper, and that car was missing when the fire department responded. Again, they never could have known. They're piecing all of this together as these days are passing. And so at this point, they worried that maybe the couple had gone off somewhere and got lost, or maybe something more nefarious happened. And just days later, after putting all of this together, the couple's missing car was located. And 38-year-old Travis Vader was arrested because I guess he was the one that had it. Now, despite never finding the bodies of Marie or Lyle, Travis ultimately was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Obviously, I'm not going into a lot of detail on this. If you really want me to, I can do an entirely separate video on this. But what I will say is that his case is very, very complicated. It's not even clear what evidence they had to connect him to their deaths. They never found the bodies of the McCanns. And so it took years and years of him being found, not guilty several times before ultimately he was found guilty of manslaughter in 2016. There was lots of technical issues. It was honestly just a mess. But ultimately, he was sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility and 7 years. So around now. And this entire time, he has maintained his innocence in regards to the assumed deaths of the McCanns. Now, Travis had a history, like I said, of theft and arson. There were weapons charges, and now he's, technically in the eyes of the law, been found guilty of the deaths of 2 older individuals. And so it seems like people were mainly connecting him to Stephanie's case because of those specific details. Since he had a history of theft and Stephanie's gold watch watch was missing, maybe he could have taken that. Since there was boiling water that was left on the stove, some people believe that was a really crappy attempt at arson. And also the age of the McCanns aligning with Stephanie's and the locations being in close proximity. Now, the area where the camper was found is about an hour and a half from the fire tower. So while it's still close, it's not as close as I was assuming it was going to be when I first heard that people were making this connection. However, one thing that I did notice was that Yellowhead Highway, which is what Minnow Lake Campground is off of, eventually turns into Highway 40, which is the highway that goes right beside the fire tower. And if he did live a transient lifestyle, he didn't have like a solid address, maybe he wandered those trails or stayed at those campgrounds around Stephanie's cabin, and maybe he knew of Stephanie. Honestly, who knows? But I just don't see a connection personally beyond that. And it doesn't seem, again, that authorities have said they believe there's any connection between Travis Vader and whatever happened to Stephanie. And for someone who has a history of arson and successful arson at that, I just have a hard time believing he would have chosen a pot of boiling water, which is possibly the slowest method of starting a fire imaginable. I just think it is way more easily explained that she had been getting ready for the day, making coffee or tea, and got interrupted. We did also have a connection to drugs in the area, so maybe it could be a combination of this theory and the original theory that this had something to do with the trafficking happening in the area. However, I have just yet to see anything at all that has stuck out and made me believe that this is a very possible theory. Again, if you know more than I do, if you have more details, feel free to share it down below. I personally feel that this was someone that knew Stephanie. I think it was someone that knew her routine, someone that knew exactly where to go and what time to go, someone that she trusted. She had a busy day ahead. She was in the middle of getting her morning going, and all of her work was by the book. She'd been doing this for 18 years now. So I just feel like either someone she knew came and knocked on her door and it caused her to stop for a minute, and then things got out of hand. The only other thing I can think of is maybe someone came up and said they were in distress or something and took advantage of her. But again, that seems very targeted and like someone that at least had watched her for a while. I just don't think this was some random crime, someone that just so happened to be passing through this area. Authorities believe there is someone out there that absolutely knows what happened, that has some sort of information that will be helpful, and they're waiting for the moment that information comes in. I've seen a lot of locals talking on different platforms online about how they strongly feel, after hearing things through the grapevine, again, take that with a grain of salt, that the police know exactly who was behind this, and they're just waiting for the right evidence and enough information to go ahead. From the research that I've done, it seems that the historical homicide unit, who now is over Stephanie's case, they never close cases, which is awesome. That means that Stephanie's case will continue to be pursued, and they have even said that they feel strongly this is fully solvable. It's just about the right person coming forward. So the best we can do right now is to continue to tell Stephanie's story, so whoever is out there with all of the answers eventually gets caught. She was just a sweet woman trying to protect and preserve the thing that she loved the most, doing her service for the public to keep them safe. She possibly experienced the most horrific thing in her favorite place on earth, and someone should have to answer for that. Let me know what you think down in the comments below, and please share this story, whether it's my video or anything you can find about Stephanie online, to make sure that people remember her and remember that her case is still unsolved, and there is possibly a monster out there wandering around that is behind it, living their life still as if nothing has happened. I want to thank you guys so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to Stephanie's story, and anything you do to share her story beyond this. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and go, you guys. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Hallan fam. Please do so that we can bring them home together or bring them justice together. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.